Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It's nice to see you. Okay, so today we are talking about Parshat Vayigash. Vayigash is a dramatic parsha. There's a whole lot that happens in this portion. All the drama surrounding Joseph, occurs over several portions. This one marks the actual revelation of Joseph to his brothers, right? I'm your brother, the long lost brother. And also the reunion then between Joseph and his father, which is our focus for today. What happens when they actually get together? So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I wanted to start with just some verses themselves, and then we'll see what the Sfas Emes has to do.
Erin, if you just want to zoom in just a little bit. Also.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I apologize.
That's okay. Not a big deal.
Let's see. I can do even more. Okay, so here we go. We start here. In Genesis 45, Vayomer Yosef el Echav ani Yosef. Joseph says to his brothers, "Hey, it's me. I'm Joseph. Ha'od avichai." His first question is our father still alive? Is my father still alive? That's what he really wants to know. V'lo yachlu echav la'anototo. And his brothers could not answer. Ki nivhalu mifanav, because they were so shocked or startled by his presence. Okay, so this is the big moment. Now I'm skipping from verse 3 to 14, right? In which Joseph and his brothers really orchestrate their father Jacob's journey to Egypt to visit this son whom he thought dead for 22 years. So I just want to say that again, 22 years. That's a very long time. I mean, a day is a long time to think someone you love is dead, but all the more so 22 years is right decades of living in a different kind of consciousness and reckoning with a devastating loss. So what happens when Jacob sees when Jacob sees his son again? Vayipol al tzavarei Binyamin echav vayevk. I'm sorry, I skipped. Sorry. This moment, excuse me, I jumped ahead. This is the moment of Joseph with his brothers. Vayipol al tzavarei Binyamin achiv vayevk. Right. So Joseph falls on Benjamin's neck and he weeps. Ubinyamin bacha al tzavarav, and Benjamin cries. Right. So Joseph and Benjamin are sons of the same mother, and therefore particularly close. And so the sort of text hones in on what happens to them. And you can see that there's a lot of tears. And Joseph is clearly a crier, because not only does he and Benjamin cry on one another's necks, but Joseph then cries on the necks of all of his brothers. And then his brothers opened their mouths to speak. And there's kind of this sense that whereas beforehand they were not able to speak, right, because they were, quote, startled by his presence, there's some kind of catharsis that happens, or some kind of emotional opening that takes place between Joseph and his brothers through the medium of tears, it seems, and they are now able to speak. They sort of cry their way into speech, maybe. But now, what I was saying before is the moment of Jacob and Joseph's reunion. So Vaya Esor Yosef Merkavto, Vaya'al Likrat Yisrael Aviv Goshna. Right. So Joseph harnessed his chariot and he went up to meet his father to Goshen, and he appeared to him. Vayar Elav, Vayipol al Tzavarav, Vayevk al Tzavarav Od. So translation, and he appeared to him and he fell on his neck and he wept on his neck for a long time. You're just looking at the Hebrew. I think the English clarifies already, or it makes an interpretive, does some interpretive work. But if you look at the Hebrew, Vayipol al tzavarav, Vayevk al tzavarav od, there's a little bit of ambiguity about who's crying on whose neck, or are both of them crying, right? Is it a grand right? A dramatic reunion between father and son. And one could read it that way. But what's interesting to note is that the commentators really don't read it that way and instead focus on the singular grammatical form of Vayipol and Vayevk, suggesting that only one party cried and only one party fell on the neck of the other. And so Rashi says on the words Vayevk, Aval Yaakov lo nafal al tzavare Yosef velo nashko. Jacob did not fall on Joseph's neck, nor did he kiss him. Ve'amru rabotenu shehaya koreh et shema. Okay, so the rabbis, says Rashi, quoting other midrashim, the rabbis suggest that while Joseph was really busy having an emotional, tear-filled reaction to seeing his father after these decades apart, his dad prayed. His dad was reciting the Shema. What I'd really like to do is pause here and ask for some feedback, but I think I'm gonna, I'll ask you, put some ideas in the chat, even while we explore this, put some ideas into this chat. The link is posted, let's do it again. But why you might think that Jacob didn't cry. Why did Jacob not cry? Joseph cries, but Jacob didn't cry. I'm going to stop the screen share for a moment. I know I don't usually do this, but I am very interested if you have thoughts about why it is that in this grand reunion, Jacob doesn't cry. Okay, so Ilana Axel says, Jacob gives thanks to God before embracing his own emotion over reuniting with Joseph. Right, okay, so great. So we're actually gonna come back to an idea, right? What is the nature of this prayer? It says that he was reciting Kriyat Shema. He was reciting, right, the prayer of the Shema. Was that because it was time for Shacharit and he didn't want to miss that opportunity? Was it right, a prayer of thanksgiving? Right, thank you, God, for this moment. Now I'm going to go hug my son. Anne says maybe shock, right, that perhaps he can't cry. He's just like the brothers, right, just like the brothers in their initial moment of encounter, right, when Joseph says, it's me, right, they couldn't speak, right, and it took some time until they could actually kind of soften or find their way maybe out of that shock to be able to maybe hug back, cry back, and certainly speak back. Okay, and then Judith says Jacob had time in the journey to Egypt to move through many feelings before seeing his son, maybe, right? So maybe, I don't know what you're thinking, Judith, but maybe we're wondering what was going on for him. Didn't he have some time to process this? But that being said, this is his first time laying eyes on the son he thought dead. Okay, somebody says a deathbed Shema, his soul, this is Martha Gunsberg, his soul was going to expire at the meeting. Interesting, right? That's a really good thought, right? When Jacob learns that Joseph is alive, he says, okay, now I can die. That is something that he says, right? And then perhaps when he meets him, he thinks, right, okay, now I can. So here's my deathbed confession kind of thing. Okay, so Mavis, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Okay, so Julie Cole and Mavis Ring both say different things, but interesting ones related to mixed emotions. That maybe, says Julie, maybe he had mixed feelings because this meant that his other sons had lied to him, right? So I think that's a really important point to try to enter the mind of Jacob. It's obviously just an imaginative exercise, but sure, this is a tremendously joyful emotional reunion with a child that he thought dead, right? But the implications are tremendous for his relationships, both with his other children who lied to him, right? Who didn't tell them to tell him that he was sold and was alive, right? And also says, Mavis Ring, he could have a mix of emotions. Joseph doesn't let him know that he's alive earlier, and it's facing the reality of his other son's crime. Okay, so you also incorporated what was previously said, but let's just note what was first said here. He could have a mix of emotions because Joseph isn't just alive. Joseph is alive and like way high on the totem pole. And though there wasn't, necessarily a mail system, or certainly not an email system back then, perhaps the message could have gotten to his father earlier. Why didn't Joseph try to reach his dad for 22 years, as far as we know? What's up with that? Right. And one could imagine some resentment, anger, disappointment, sadness, a whole host of other things that Jacob might be feeling, not only seeing him, but seeing his station, right? And so Barb Truitt says Jacob is seeing an Egyptian coming down from a chariot. Okay, that's interesting too. The last time Jacob had seen him, Joseph was a teenager. Was this really his son? That's a great point, right? Like maybe he doesn't even know who he's looking at. But I wanted to just connect that to what I was saying a moment ago, which is that this is not only a child who has not spoken to his dad or reached out to his dad, but right, this is a child of such high station, right, that maybe Jacob has to wrestle with that at the moment. Right. He's not encountering a son who's, living in terrible circumstances, despondent and unable to have any agency of his own, but rather the opposite. He's seeing someone of great power, and maybe he's wondering about the choices that Joseph has made. Okay, I'm going to say the last one, and then we're going to come back to our text. Ilana Axel says, through Kriyat Shema, Jacob understands that the prophecy will indeed be fulfilled through Joseph. When he thought Joseph was dead, perhaps he had doubts about his entire life's purpose. Interesting. So interesting. So interesting. There's a theme about back in Parshat Vayeshev. The Midrash understands Jacob as someone who, and we talked about this, Bikesh Yaakov Leshev B'Shalva. Jacob wanted peace, right? And according to the Midrash, right, he was denied it and told essentially, like, you can't get ahead of the story. You got to live through the story. You can't get ahead of the story. And this is a 22-year-long story. And Ilan, I think you said beautifully, right, that at the end of 22 years, perhaps there's some recognition on Jacob's part. Aha, right? Maybe this is like this is the coda to that story that began so long ago, and I'm seeing its fulfillment. And yeah, maybe there was a whole lot of feelings about God in the interim that he's now coming back to God after maybe years of some doubts and uncertainties. That's a really interesting perspective. Okay, so I'm going to keep going a little bit. Getting those words back on the screen for a moment. Okay, so now here's an interesting twist. Okay, so here's the Sfas Emes speaking in 1873. And he's thinking about these words of Yaakov Kara Kriyat Shema, right? That Jacob read Kriyat Shema. He says, Divrei Maharal Yeduim, the words of the Maharal of Prague, Rav Yehuda Lowy ben Betzalel of Prague, the famous golem maker, maybe you might know of him. So he says that what that guy says is really well known, and we'll have a moment to look at that. But he then goes on to say, Uma sheyosef lo kara kriyat shema, amarnu, ... I want you to notice that the question that the Sfat Emet has on this moment is not, why did Jacob not cry? His question is, why did Joseph not pray? I'm going to repeat that, right? He's not interested in why Jacob acted stoically, let's say, why didn't he cry? His starting point is, given the great piety of Jacob, and clearly the moment calls for prayer, where was Joseph's prayer? Okay. And he says, this is the Sfas Emes. The Sfas Emes says, it's well known what the Maharal of Prague had to say about this matter. So I'm going to take us there. go down. Here's what the Maharal said on this matter. Vayevk al tzavarav od. That's a quote from the initial verse. Okay, that Joseph cried. Aval, I'm over here. Aval Yaakov lo nafal al tzavare Yosef velo nashko ve'amru rabbeinu shehaya koreh et shma. Right, and that was from Rashi that we also saw. Right, that the rabbis say that Jacob was busy saying Shema. Acharei kol haga'aguim ve'akisufim lirot et beno chavivo. After all of the longing and the yearnings to see his beloved son, keshera'a et Yosef ve'ahavto, higia el marom piskata. Sorry, keshera'a Yosef ve'ahavato higia el marom piskata. Chashash shema ta'ale ahava azazo al ahavat Hashem. V'hitchazek davka be'oto rega be'avat Hashem v'kara shema. Okay, I'm going to translate that. When he saw Joseph, his beloved son, and his love like swelled in him to the highest, I don't know how it translates here, but amarom piskata, like it rose to like its highest peak. He was just swelling with love for his child. Chashash shema ta'ale ahava azazo al ahavat Hashem. Jacob got worried. He worried that his love for his son would overtake his love for God. And v'hitchazek davka be'oto rega. And so he strengthens himself. He fortifies himself, and he like focuses on what's important, and he says Shema, because the words of Shema say ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha bechol levavcha, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and he understands that to mean more than his own son. Now, I don't like this interpretation very much, but gotta share with you what's there. It's very striking, and I think that we collectively as a people we've got some therapy to do, I think, about father-son relationships, parent-child relationships, because it's like not obvious in the Torah that privileging children is actually what is most admired. Here I'm thinking about Akedat Yitzchak, right? We got to wrestle with this. Ultimately, Abraham does not sacrifice Isaac, but it is the test of his love seems to be, would he be willing to do so? And I hope if you've been with me for a while, there are all sorts of ways that we can interpret that, and the Sfas Emes does some of that for us. But the fact of the facts of the case are, it sounds like God is saying to Abraham, can you show me that you love me more? And similarly here, it isn't so much God saying it to Jacob, but Jacob, being the pious individual that he is, recognizes that he needs to demonstrate that his love for God supersedes his love for his son. And so he stops himself, it sounds like. He stops himself from overwhelming emotion to privilege, right, God at this moment. So that's interesting. That is what the Maharal has to say. And given that, okay, I hope I really do love the Sfat Emet, but I find it interesting. That's what first of all, he says that that's known in the world, in his world. Presumably this perspective is widely known, maybe even widely ascribed to, if one could say that. What we see here is that from the Sfat Emet's perspective, right, and he's writing like 200 years later, he says, yeah, the Maharal's right. So what's up with Joseph? Could he love his dad more than God? Where are his priorities? Like, why isn't he getting his priorities straight? And he says, Amarnu kvar ki ze bechinat Yosef sheyachol latzni atzmo shelo yihye nekar al panav et mahuto. He says that, of course, Joseph prayed, right? That's his answer. Not, of course, Jacob was really emotional, but but here's the reasons why he couldn't cry yet, or something like that. On the contrary, the right order of emotions is to put God first. And we know Jacob did the right thing. So it must be that Joseph did the right thing too. And Joseph certainly was praying. The difference was that Joseph is someone who knows how to live in secret, he says. Joseph is someone who knows how to hide himself so that he won't be recognizable, so that he won't be known by his face. Right? On the one hand, this is something very literal, right? That Joseph is somebody who's brothers don't recognize him. Now, yes, it's been 22 years, and I imagine seeing a young child and then seeing an adult would be very different. And also, as somebody else had said in the chat before, right? Joseph's a quasi-Egyptian, like Moshe will be too, right? He's a quasi-Egyptian. So he might not be recognizable in terms of his clothing and his appearance. His brothers might not know him. I think there's also suggestions that, right, Joseph, in a sense, right, is someone who lives a double life. Maybe because he feels like he needs to hide his Jewish identity. Maybe he's just really good at living out a multiplicity of identities. He's a Jewish guy and he's also an Egyptian guy. He's from a kind of humble family, but he's also royalty. He's Joseph, but he's also Tzafnat Paneach, which is the name that is given to him by Potiphar, I believe. But he literally is a person with dual names. So is Jacob, by the way, but we're going to bracket that for a moment. Right. So he says here, Adam al nisayon mirachok shemechazek atzmo. He says that this is actually a benefit, or maybe you can say this is a byproduct. I'm adding that word and it doesn't say that. A byproduct of the distance that he had from his family. Right? 22 years apart from his family means 22 years of not living in his family culture. 22 years of not, getting the family jokes or knowing the inside stuff or being like the brothers, dressing like the brothers, engaging in the brothers' profession, right? He's not really much of a shepherd. Right. So his distance from his family has made him carve out a different kind of identity and maybe helped him go underground a little bit. Which on the one hand meant that there's a suggestion that he could and he did retain a sense of his origins while also learning how to live in other ways explicitly, right? To dress as an Egyptian and be a Jew at home, so to speak. He knew how to do that. And so the suggestion here is that because he had such training in basically multitasking or multi-identitying, if you could say that, right? He knew how to do that. And so he could be both human, crying for his father, and kind of, spiritually connected at the same time. He didn't live in a bifurcated way, right? The suggestion is that unlike Jacob, who had to kind of compartmentalize his interpersonal relationships and his God relationship, Joseph actually had an advantage. He had a lot of practice in doing both things simultaneously and doing lots of things simultaneously. And so he could cry and pray at the same time. He's capable of that. And the Sfas Emet says, Al yedei zeh marviach sheyachol lihiyot tov beseter gamken. B'derech haster gamken, excuse me. Derech haseter gamken. This means, says the Sfas Emet, that because he knew how to essentially live in hiding, right, it could also be used for his advantage, right? He could also do good or be good in hidden ways. So he was a more closeted prayer, I suppose. Okay, so I am very interested in contemplating the character of Jacob, the non-crier, perhaps outside of the frame of the Sfat Emet, as we were doing before, to think about why it is that he doesn't cry. And it's also interesting to imagine Joseph, who is a crier, also as a praying person, right? As someone who lives between worlds, between emotions, between people, between kind of the vertical and the horizontal. He knows how to do both of those at the same time. And he's known to be more of a cosmopolitan. And one of the ways that he demonstrates that is through this kind of like code switching or capacity to do two things at once. That said, I want to share with you today an alternative perspective because this doesn't feel satisfying to me. And I wanted to consider the possibility that we don't side only with those who privilege, divine love over human love, but actually make space for Jacob's emotional landscape, not as a non-emotional place, but a differently emotional place, maybe. So here is a statement from Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who is not a Hasidic thinker, but I like what he has to say on this, and so I brought it for you. He says, Yosef bacha, Yaakov lo bacha od. In the verse, it says, I'm going to go up. I'm sorry if I'm making you dizzy here. Sincere apologies. I don't like this myself, but here it is. Here, the phrase in talking about this moment of reconciliation or reunion, rather, includes the term vayef al tzavarav od. He cried on his neck. It's translated as for a long time, but od just means more. And so Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch is interested a little bit in that word od. What does it mean that he cried od? Yosef was able to cry more, he suggests, but Jacob could not cry more. Yaakov lo bacha od. He couldn't cry anymore. Yaakov kvar kila livkot. Jacob already finished crying. Yosef bacha od b'sha'a sheYaakov diber ito. But Joseph continued to cry. Should I do this in English? Jacob had lived until this point a life of constancy. Now, I translated that word constancy, but I subsequently asked an Israeli friend, and chad goni, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, literally means one color or monotonous, constant. But I like the imagery of color because I think it's somehow poignant here, right? He lived in a certain color, right? He lived in gray. For 22 years, he lived in gray. Hu bacha et Yosef, right? He cried for this child every day. Ha'evel shalat b'chol chayav hanafshiyim. His grief controlled his life, reigned, dominated his life. His inner life, his spiritual life, his emotional life was completely overtaken by grief. Ach, b'chayei Yosef, Rabu hatmurot v'chalifot v'lo hayta lo shehut lefanot et libo litzar hapreda. Joseph, though, now this is a different twist on what the Sfat Emet was talking about before, about Joseph's kind of bifurcated life. Joseph was living a life, a colorful life. Joseph of the Technicolor dream code, right? He was living a life of color. He was having all kinds of exciting, escapades in Egypt. He's rising up. Yeah, he also is falling down, right? He's got this whole thing with Potiphar's wife and he gets thrown in prison, right? But then he starts really being promoted. He kind of he had distractions, we'll say it that way. He had a lot of distractions from his own grief. He says that he didn't have the time to turn his heart literally to the pain of his separation from his family. He was able to live in a technicolor, as we said, way. Right? The present was able to fill his heart. Right? He continued to have a life, essentially. Rak ata b'sha'a shenafal al tzavarei aviv hu chash et kol tsa'ar hapreda. Says, but this moment when he fell on his father's neck, he felt it all came rushing back. He got in touch with all the pain of this separation. V'chai od pa'am et ha'esrim hashnayim shekvar avru. Esrim hashanim, shekvar avru. It's like in this one moment, right? Joseph like telescoped the 20 plus years of separation because he hadn't really dealt with it until this time. He hadn't dealt with it. He was busy living this other life because for good reason. He, life was good for him. He had a lot going on. But his poor father was just left a broken man living entirely under the cloud of grief for 22 years. So the claim here, right, is not that Joseph, I keep doing that, that Jacob, didn't cry because he was so pious. He didn't cry because he had no more tears left to cry. He just had no more tears left to cry. Not because he loves his son less or loves God more or whatever. He was so, empty of tears by the time he gets to this point, as opposed to Joseph, who has an entirely different emotional experience because he's a different person with a different constitution. B, had a different life story over the course of these years. And so even though, yes, both father and son are deeply, deeply moved, overwhelmed by this moment of the unimaginable, right? That they both thought the others were gone. Joseph didn't know if his father was alive, but he didn't think he would necessarily see him again. And Jacob, of course, thought that his son was dead. So here they have this unimaginable moment. And according to Samson and Falhirsch, it's just they manifested it in different ways. And I think it's this one, to my mind, resonates more. And I appreciate the way that it, talking about monotone or multicolored or technicolor, it just leaves a lot more space for a multiplicity of emotional reactions to things, joyous or otherwise. I was recently because the portion was recent, but I believe it was 2 weeks ago, the Parsha, when Jacob is told, or when he's shown this technicolor dream coat, right? He says, Tarof Yosef, right? Joseph was eaten by a beast. And the next words, I believe, are Vayefk, right? He cries. He's a man, he knows how to cry, right? And it seems like once that faucet was turned on, right, it never stopped, right? Until this moment, either because he had no tears to cry anymore, or maybe he didn't need to cry anymore, right? He had grieved all the grief that there was, and now he's turning towards something else. So that's perhaps even another angle. Okay, so I'm going to stop here with the share and see your faces again. Okay, so let's open this up a little bit. I'd love to hear thoughts either about Jacob or about Joseph or about this struggle that seems to be in our history between filial love, like love for people, love for one's kin, and divine love, or really just a reflection on what we just read, which is that sometimes there are no more tears to cry. Yes, Herschel, go ahead.
I am Herschel out here in Encinitas, California.
Hi.
I'm a first timer with this group, so I say Booker Toe to all of you. It's still morning out here. And, this reminds me of my family's dynamic with my parents. I was estranged from my family for in excess of 35 years. I would see them once in a while, but it was very tense because I had left the Jewish people, I had converted to another religion, and there was a big wall, thanks to my first wife, who felt very uncomfortable because she always felt she wasn't good enough for the family, although the family never gave her any reason to be that way. But I remember after I finally ended that marriage and I began my road back and seeing my sister, especially, we're very close, there are just the two of us, and how emotional I was. I remember I went over, she lives over in Arizona, about 8 hours from here. And I went there for Rosh Hashanah after having not gone to shul for decades.
Mm.
And we sang the Be'aftah prayer, and I just bawled
Wow. Mm-hmm.
because my kids aren't Jewish.
Mm.
And I never got a chance to make peace with my mom, unfortunately. But I did with my dad. And as he lay dying, my sister on one side of his bed and me on the other were telling him, Dad, quit fighting, go to sleep. I told Dad, when you see Mom, tell her I'm sorry.
Oh. Yeah.
And you know, it was very emotional for me. I don't know if I actually shed tears.
I might.
I'm not. My mother and I weren't criers, and as I gotten older, I've become a real ball baby. But you know, now, well, that's because I'm in the 12-step program and I got emotionally healed. But anyhow, I can relate to this whole scenario between Joseph and Jacob, and the fact that Joseph had, in a sense, converted. He'd become an Egyptian prince, dressed and carried himself as an Egyptian. That's why Jacob didn't recognize him. He probably had his face all made up and all shaved and all that stuff that the Egyptians used to do, and all the garb and all the thing.
That's interesting.
So, you know, that's probably why Jacob didn't recognize him. But that wasn't the case in my family. We knew what each other looked like. And it's so good to be back together.
Thank you so much for sharing. That sounds really powerful and really emotional. And I'm particularly moved by your sharing the place of Ve'ahavta, because that's the same verse that, you know, that Jacob is presumably thinking about as well. Ve'ahavta
I have a comment about that. Jacob wasn't aware of the Torah, so he didn't know about the Ve'ahavta.
Well, yeah, that never stopped commentators.
But in essence, he may have, you know, but.
Yeah, anachronism is the name of the game.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much. Others? Anyone else want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'd like to. I heard something beautiful about we never found out why Joseph never contacted his father.
Right.
And his father never asked.
Yeah.
So I don't remember where this was from, but it's the same with Hashem, that when somebody goes away, is not part of Judaism and comes back, then Hashem doesn't ask why. He never asks why. It's always accepting. So I thought that was something different.
Beautiful. Sorry, I'm just muting myself over here because there's some heating sounds, but I'll be back in a moment. Someone else. Ilana, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm not in disagreement about your disturbance of the emotional closure of our models here, but I wanted to add to that some other perspectives, and one comes from actually the experience of the fact that I train our Bet Mitzvah students at my congregation. And because of COVID, so many of them had to reschedule. And so now we have kids who are very young and inexperienced in life, who are now having to be prepared and then meet with me to continue reviewing for up to a year, like monthly. And in every single case that I've seen, when they come to they're finally getting to the rehearsal where they're coming to the sanctuary and actually reading in the scroll, and now it's really going to finally happen, they are all shut down emotionally. And they only at that first, I do 3 rehearsals and before the date, and only at that first rehearsal do they begin to like open up that shell and begin to think, now I'm getting excited, but they all come in like completely shut down. And it's because of this having to delay gratification for so long. And so I think about Jacob in this context, of somebody who actually is very much older and experienced in life and has, a lot more experience than even a Joseph in delaying gratification and, establishing, do I really believe that this is really happening and what is the meaning for my life? And so I still like to add that layer of him taking moments to acknowledge, the great miraculous containers of our lives and thanking God for that before he allows himself to then just kind of rush into the emotional story. So that, to me, that's actually religious spiritual discipline, not just, emotional stoppage. So yeah, we're trained to, you say the blessing before you eat, you don't just jump into the food. So it's sort of, that's where my thought was about that. But I love this passage for all the different models of grieving that it gives us, and the models of joy. And I think it reminds me also in my pastoral work, not to judge a person who's in mourning if they're not crying, and how to not have them fit my expectations.
Yeah. I shared this is trigger warning, this is heavy, but I shared this text with somebody recently who told me about, and she's substantially younger than I am, and she told me about a peer of hers who lost a child, and in the ICU, the child died, and the nurse actually said to the parents, like, where are your tears? Terrible pastoral move. Like, wow, what a bad reaction. But this mother, this grieving mother, and the child was 2 years old, and the grieving mother said kind of exactly these words: I have been crying for 2 whole years, day in and day out, and now my child's at rest, or something like that. There's no right way, but there's no wrong way. And never expect people to react any one way. And so, yeah, I thank you for raising it as an important pastoral insight to carry. Okay, thank you. Judy Shermer, go ahead.
Hi, I'm really enjoying your teachings. And I really liked the last interpretation. I thought it was a lot more humanity in it. But also I thought about, the fact that Jacob was living all those years with the idea that his son was torn apart by beasts and was dead. Joseph didn't have that thought of his father being dead. He probably just assumed he was still alive. In fact, he asks, is my father well?
Right.
So he didn't live with that kind of grief.
Right.
So that just, kind of adds to that final interpretation about Jacob having this grief over his son's being dead in a violent way.
Yeah.
Also.
Wow. Yes. That's really an important insight. I wonder, maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but when you also raise the kind of violence of it, I wonder if there's particularly, there's the shock of Joseph's being alive, unquestionably, but also just the idea of maybe like bodily integrity, right? That he's like in one piece, right? Literally in one piece, was maybe shock on top of shock on top of shock on top of shock. Yeah, just thank you. Jan Mahler, go ahead.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you first, Erin, because you are really a master at this, and I appreciate that so much. You are great at explaining things, and I study your Torah weekly with a Hevruta partner, but I've discovered that when I come on Thursdays, my eyes are opened even more. So thank you.
Honored.
But I wanted to say, as the patriarch, I think that it might be really difficult to show that kind of emotion as the patriarch. And Jacob seems to be kind of a master manipulator in that way. Not that I think that he's doing that now, but he's certainly with his brother, you know, he knew he was going to be really emotional when he met him. So he just like threw everybody else on the other side of the river first. And so he could get his stuff together, so to speak. And, you know, he doesn't really show any emotion when he's actually getting the blessing, it doesn't seem like, or.
Which episode are you referring to?
I'm talking about the blessing from Isaac. He
Oh,
didn't really like say anything to Esau, like, yeah, well, I might have screwed up, but sorry, you know. So he has a certain image, maybe also. I mean, I agree that I think he cried, you know, his tears were done already. But also I think it is really hard I mean, I see that with my 94-year-old mother. She's almost 94, actually, technically. That she's not going to show me her real emotions. And I think that can be the case in a lot of families. That
deliberately, are you saying deliberately?
Well, I don't know if she's that woke, but she's just not going to let it. I mean, she'll scream and yell. Yes, this is what 94-year-olds do, but she's not going to show me what's really going on inside.
What does that have to do with being a patriarch or matriarch and your understanding of what that is? Can you just say another word about that?
Oh, you know, like you hold a position of, you want to hold maybe a position of respect and authority. And so like maybe letting your guard down in that moment when they're all there, right? Maybe, I mean, I think he was ready to die, especially then too. So, but
yeah.
And then, you know, I can't wait till we get to all the blessings that he gives his children next week, right?
Just wait.
Oh, it's this week. Oh, you didn't even deal with that? Oh, okay.
Just wait. There's more. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Martha, go ahead. Are you unmuting? There you go.
I've been thinking about the brothers, and when you're talking about how Jacob suffered for 22 years and cried for 22 years, how did the brothers live with that, with what they had created?
Yeah.
And that they kept that lie going and that deception going for 22 years. They never told their father the truth. They never, it's just, I mean, we have like this pattern of deception going on through the generations.
Yeah. They say that the 22 years that Joseph was separated from his father was a kind of payback for the 22 years that Jacob was separated from his father, Isaac. And that is right. He willfully ran away and created this family separation. And as a kind of, you know, cosmic response / punishment, you might say, he was separated from his own son for 22 years. So yeah, we have like long histories, and I think they were being purposefully highlighted. Those numbers are significant because they do highlight the repetition, right? This family dysfunction that repeats and repeats and repeats. And we hope it can find some redemption, but we unfortunately do live with those stories of families that struggle with how to actually stay together. But yes, the idea, sorry, but to your point about the 22 years, the length of time that this ruse was Leib is incredible. It's incredible. I think on the one hand, it seems, even more mind-boggling that they could keep it up for so long. And on the other hand, when you've lived inside of a lie for so long, excuse me, right, it's hard to come out of it. I don't know what amount of time that is, but I can imagine that those brothers, after a certain moment in time, could no longer.
They're always presented. They're always presented in the Torah readings as so righteous, to be looked up to. They don't strike me that way at all.
Yeah. So and Jacob didn't see them that way ultimately. Right. Not all the blessings, blessings. Like Yehuda and Shimon and Levi, for example, are essentially cursed, really. Anyway, for another time. But yes, also just consider the psychology of being not only the children who put this into action, but also watching your father, right, mourn for there are 11 left behind, right? And they're not good enough, so to speak. Which I think we can understand as parents why that might be, but you could understand how that could also contribute to the psychological development of those. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're gonna move. Janet, Derek, go ahead.
Maybe the whole thing about why Jacob doesn't cry. The whole problem was exacerbated by his showing preference for Joseph. And that's what got this whole jealousy and all that stuff started. So, maybe he doesn't want to stir it up again and, say, oh, my wonderful son, I'm so glad to see you again, because it might just start that whole cycle.
Interesting.
It's just a whole different perspective. But I think the parallels are so interesting about the reunion that he had, with Esau, that Jacob had with Esau. And then again here, I mean, there's just, like you said, you need some pretty heavy psychoanalysis if you're going to change and stop repeating these family issues.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I just want to highlight, there's a comment from Judith Lyons, that she says that there's also the whole episode with Dinah and how much does Jacob reveal his feelings after his sons kill Shechem and his people. I think that what is written is more concerned about Jacob's situation than the loss of life, and certainly not Dinah's feelings. Jacob lived a long and very complex life. So without going into the details of that story, it is the case that Jacob is a complicated human being. I mean, everybody's a complicated human being, but Jacob's emotional registers are not always in line with the expectations of one might expect, at any given moment. So how he relates to violence within his own family is definitely sticky. He doesn't rage against his children when they actually perpetrate violence. Coming back to the reference just a moment ago to the blessings that are given to the children to come, it's at that time that we see that Jacob even really registers that violent act of Shimon and Levi. And he does that by kind of cursing them, as I said before. But in the moment, he's not horrified in the way that one might expect. He's more concerned, as you indicate, right, about what the consequences are going to be in the family. Sorry, somebody just said something. So he's definitely a really interesting character. It's why we love to study him so much. Okay, I'm just looking to see if there's anything else in the chat before we go. Feel free to raise your hands. It's hard for me to monitor the chat and see you all the time, but Arnold Block, go ahead.
Sorry, just had to get unmuted. I mean, I wonder if there's a possibility that Jacob thought he was dead when he met Joseph, that here's my dead son, I'm joining him.
So interesting.
Maybe I'm somewhere, after all of this craziness that we just went through, and now I'm in Egypt. maybe I'm dead, and maybe it's a good thing.
Huh. That's such an interesting perspective. I'd never thought of it before, right? Like, what planet am I living on where, right? Maybe I'm a ghost meeting a ghost, crying ghost at that. Yes, thank you. Okay, Jan, you get the last word.
Well, I put it in the chat, but that
Oh, sorry.
we stop with Jacob, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, and why not Joseph?
Joseph is not considered a forefather because, not because, just noted, but right, Jacob's 12 children, forget about Dinah because he actually has more than 12, but whatever, right? Jacob's 12
probably has more than one girl,
probably,
too,
right? Exactly. Yeah, they said for every boy there was a girl. Yeah, Jacob's 12 children, right, become the tribes of Israel. And so there's no God of Judah either, even though we're called the Yehudim. So that's kind of, it is an interesting point of like, why does the story of patriarchs end there? But I guess it just proliferates, right? And after that, the generations are much, much bigger, and there's no longer the story of competing brothers in quite the same way. Right.
Well, and maybe it would create too much competition. Oh, look at, he gets all the kavod. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. We'll draw to a close here. Come back next week for more. We'll talk about blessings or other exciting things. All right. Take care. Bye.